The afternoon they buried both my father and my mother on the family grounds in Lake Forest. The November sky hung so low that the bare oak branches behind the private Vale Cemetery looked as if they were scratching at a sheet of lead-colored tin, while the people dressed in black cashmere beneath the white canopy spoke in exactly the tone old-money Northerners use whenever death visits their house. Quiet, polished, just solemn enough to look grief-stricken without ever letting grief ruin the lines of the afternoon. The smell of damp earth, white lilies, and wet wool blended together. The Bentley parked a short distance away still held tiny beads of rain on its hood. And my brother, Ethan Vale, stood beside our parents' coffins as though it were his personal podium, and not the place where they had just lowered the two bodies that had directed our lives for so long that even their deaths looked less like an accident than a strategic decision. Ethan wore a black overcoat cut on Savile Row, the collar unmoved even in the wind, his jaw set in the way of a man raised to turn control into body language. People came up to touch his shoulder and tell him things like, "Your father was a giant, and your mother built a room just by entering it," then glanced at me with that expression so carefully taught in upper-class families, half discreet pity and half curiosity, as though I were a minor detail in an inheritance scene whose ending every end. He had already assumed. I stood half-shadowed beneath a yew tree, my hands so cold the knuckles had gone white inside my leather gloves, listening to the first clods of dirt strike the oak with a dry, hollow sound. And in that moment I understood that from then on, no one around me was looking at this as a funeral anymore. They were looking at it as a transfer of power. And Ethan, with that composure of his that always hovered just this side of cruelty, knew it too. He turned to me after the last member of the board dipped his head and stepped toward his car, his lips barely moving, enough that no one but me could hear him. "It's over now," he said. Then, after the briefest pause, as though the afternoon were not already cold enough, he added, "Everything is mine." If I had been a stranger, I might have expected myself to answer with something more obvious. Anger, humiliation, maybe even a contemptuous smile. But I only looked at him, looked at the raindrops sliding down the brim of my black hat, looked at how impossibly sharp and pressed his suit still seemed on the day our parents had just been lowered into the ground, and heard a very old, very cold thought rise from the place it had been sleeping for years. Ethan always says the line of victory too early. He always thinks he has won before the real game has even begun, and perhaps because he had been taught his whole life to trust in his rightful place as heir. He had never learned how to recognize the traps that only open once a person is convinced he has already walked through them safely. My name is Olivia Vale. I was 38 the winter my parents died, the second child of Charles Vale and Alina Vale, the younger sister of Ethan Vale, the man the financial press across the Midwest had been calling the natural successor to our family empire long before my father ever agreed to die. We were not rich in the lottery tech startup new money way. The Vales were rich in the old way. Land, rail lines, inland ports, trusts, walnut-paneled boardrooms, oil portraits of ancestors lining the halls, and political promises never committed to paper. Vale Meridian Holdings, the conglomerate my father expanded from my grandfather's logistics company into a sprawling network of freight infrastructure, inland depots, industrial developments, infrastructure funds, and strategic holdings scattered across the Midwest, did more than feed our family. It fed a whole atmosphere around us, the kind where household staff knew to wear soft-soled shoes on stone floors. Family lawyers said stewardship instead of ownership. And children were taught very early that money was not something one discussed directly, but something one learned to feel in the way other people stood up when your father entered a room. I grew up in Briar House, a limestone Georgian estate overlooking a lake as cold and metallic as a blade, with ceilings too high, hallways too long, Persian rugs so thick they swallowed the sound of footsteps, and a silence that was never truly silence, because in houses like that, every closed door, every crystal glass set down, every sea. Arvant's cough beyond the hallway carried news about power. Ethan was taught from the beginning that he belonged inside that power. I was taught to stand close enough to watch it work, but never close enough to touch the center of it. There was something my mother said to me when I was 12, on an early autumn evening after dinner, that I remember more clearly than most things she said to me as an adult. I had been standing outside the library in my navy velvet dress for Sunday dinner, listening to my father talk to Ethan inside about a container yard deal in Joliet. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, only scattered words like margin, rail access, timing, control. My mother passed by, saw me standing there, and stopped. She did not ask what I was doing. She only straightened the bow at my neckline with hands that always smelled faintly of white musk, and said, in exactly the tone one might use to tell a child what our tea would be served in the sitting room, "He's the future, Olivia. You're different." She stopped right where a warm mother would have put in something soft and merciful like special or free, or brilliant in your own way. My mother did not. She left the space hanging between us and made me fill it in myself. For years, I tried every meaning I could. I thought she meant I was more sensitive, less decisive, unsuited for rooms full of men smoking cigars and speaking in low voices. I thought she meant I was intelligent in a way that was not useful. I thought she was only trying not to hurt me. Looking back now, I understand what she really meant was this. Ethan was what they could display as the future. I was what they needed to keep at the edge. The one who would see more clearly, remember longer, but would never be given the kind of glory that matched what she was capable of. A family like mine always needs both kinds of children. One to inherit, one to witness. They just never tell the second child that she is being trained to become the living memory of games other people think they are winning. Ethan was 4 years older than I was, and in our family that distance was never measured in years. It was measured in doors that opened for him and doors that closed to me. When Ethan was 14, my father took him to the plant in Gary on what everyone called a school break tour, though everybody knew it was the first ceremonial placing of the hand upon the future. When I was 14, I was sent to Santa Fe with my mother and a nanny to learn some culture. When Ethan was 16, he was already sitting at the end of the table during dinners attended by bankers, attorneys, and county commissioners, listening to them talk about tax abatements and land leverage. And afterward my father would ask his opinion as though the boy had anything real to say beyond the arrogance poured into his bones from the beginning. When I was 16, I was asked to go change dresses halfway through dinner because the burgundy I wore was a little too attention-seeking. I was not starved of love in the crude, obvious way outsiders know how to recognize. I was sent to the right boarding school, given piano, writing lessons, French, art history, taken to Europe in the summer, allowed to read any book in my father's private library, taken by my mother to New York to buy a cashmere coat in my first year of college. The veils were never cruel in a vulgar way. The veils were cruel in a much more elegant one. They gave you enough that the whole world could look at you and conclude you had no right to feel abandoned, while they still told you, through 1,000 actions repeated over time, that the center of the story would never belong to you. Ethan was trained to be the successor through privilege. I was trained to understand the structure beneath privilege by being excluded from it. At the time, I did not know that the quality everyone called different in me would become the only thing that kept me standing once my family began devouring itself. My father, Charles Vale, was the kind of man who made people lower their voices the moment he stepped into a room. Not because he was taller than anyone else or especially loud. Quite the opposite. He was shorter than Ethan, narrower through the shoulders than many of the men in his company, and he almost never raised his voice. But he had a way of standing completely still before he spoke, as though he believed the room would adjust its gravity around him. And more often than not, it did. He disliked rambling, disliked repetition, disliked answers that used too many words. To him, everything was order, position, timing. I once watched him end a director's career with one sentence spoken so quietly in a meeting that the man had to lean forward to catch it. "I think we're done with your judgment." The director remained seated for another 10 seconds, enough for the entire room to understand what had just happened, and then vanished from all internal documentation as if he had never existed. My mother, Eleanor Vale, was dangerous in a different way. If my father was the violence of structure, my mother was the violence of perfect surfaces. She knew how to make another woman feel understood within the first 7 minutes of speaking to her, then use precisely what that woman had revealed to place her where it best served my mother's interest. She sat on museum boards, chaired galas, remembered the names of senior staff's children, sent white flowers the day someone's wife went into the hospital, and wrote thank-you notes in elegant slanted handwriting cold enough to draw blood. She never shouted in my face, never struck me, never said anything crude, but she could make me feel diminished simply by looking at a dress I had chosen and saying, "Interesting," in a tone that left me wondering for the rest of the evening what I had gotten wrong. The two of them made Ethan as if they were crafting a silver letter opener, polished, functional, meant for display, and always appearing as though he belonged on the table where decisions were made. As for me, they let me wander far too long among the library shelves, the old prospectuses, the foundation records, the meeting minutes, and the conversations no one thought mattered, until I developed a different kind of hearing. I could hear what others missed. I could see what had been shoved into the margin. No one in that house imagined that those skills would one day matter more than Ethan's ability to shake hands with a banker, or call the proper vintage across a dinner table. Perhaps not even I imagined it. I did not enter the family business along the path everyone had drawn for Ethan. I went to Yale and studied American political history and family finance, which my father called ornamentation piled on top of analytical ability that may not be usable. I meant to go on to law school. In fact, I made it to Columbia Law for one semester. But right then, my mother suffered a minor aneurysm. Not fatal, not even especially dramatic in the end, but enough to send our whole house swaying in that very particular rich people way. Not because there was no one to care for her, but because the person they considered non-essential was suddenly called home to fill the quiet spaces between inexpensive systems. I took one semester off, then another, then I never went back. Ethan said, in that soft, cold tone he used whenever he wanted me to feel smaller without appearing openly cruel. At least now you can do something useful with the foundation. So I was installed at the Vale Foundation, the philanthropic arm of the family that funneled money into education, community health, and urban redevelopment projects. T.S. my mother liked to mention in magazines. In the eyes of the world, it was a tasteful, appropriate, suitably elegant role for the daughter who had not been chosen to inherit. In reality, that position let me see the true bloodstream of the empire. The trusts nested inside other trusts, the shell companies, the deductions, the related party transactions. The old staff kept on because they knew too much. The parcels of land held under legal entities no one in the family ever named at dinner. I sat in that underestimated chair for 12 years, listening, storing, remembering, teaching myself how to distinguish an ordinary transfer from one that smelled like panic. How to tell what a wealthy family is hiding not by what it flaunts, but by what it stops mentioning altogether. Ethan entered Vale Meridian as though stepping into a room whose door had been held open for him since the cradle. He went to Wharton, came into the company at 25, entered straight through acquisitions, and rose the way water rises through a pressure pipe, while everyone around him pretended to call it talent. To be fair, Ethan was not stupid. That was precisely what made him more dangerous than an heir who knew only how to sit still and collect what had been left to him. He was quick, intelligent, excellent at reading people, and understood that power in this world is rarely seized by being the loudest person in the room, but by making everyone else believe the decision that benefits you most is also the most sensible decision for everyone involved. He knew how to perform restraint in front of our parents. He knew how to take the dirtier tasks off their hands when they didn't want to dirty themselves directly. He knew how to make the board feel he was not merely the boss's son, but the only man ruthless enough to keep the empire growing. But there is a difference between a true successor and a man raised to believe everything will default to him eventually. Ethan always moved as though the world owed him that position. And because he had been trusted from the outset, he learned quickly that there were many things he could do at the edge of legality that our parents would not punish, so long as the core of the empire did not tremble. The first murky transactions I saw carrying Ethan's name surfaced almost 2 years before my father died. A side fund for logistics real estate in Indiana had money pushed through 3 entities only to come back disguised as a bizarre management performance allocation. A warehouse in Kenosha was sold to a company held by a distant cousin, then months later used as collateral for a loan only Ethan had authority to sign. An LLC in Delaware with an empty, mechanical name like Meridian Annex Holding was receiving steady inflows I could not trace cleanly back to any real project. I brought it to my father once, in the careful voice I had learned over years of trying to tell the truth without sounding as if I were lecturing. He looked over a few pages, gave the smallest nod, and said, "Your brother understands leverage in a way you don't." I looked at him. He looked back, and in his eyes there was something I only managed to name months later. It was not ignorance. It was knowledge left in place deliberately. That was the first moment the uneasy feeling began to grow in me, as if I were standing in front of a game whose cards had been dealt long ago, but no one had admitted aloud that we were already playing. My parents died together on the road back from the city to Lake Forest in late November. An accident too banal to be called anything prettier than the carelessness of wealthy people who believe schedules can still command the weather. Their Mercedes Maybach slid across an early sheet of ice formed by freezing rain. The driver jerked the wheel. The car broke through the barrier and struck a steel post broadside. The driver lived. My parents did not. The story hit local news before the coroner officially confirmed it. Within 6 hours, Briar House was full. Lawyers, PR people, house staff, the family doctor, 3 relatives from my mother's side, 2 from my father's, and an Episcopal priest my mother had never liked but thought had good presentation. Ethan arrived shortly before midnight, straight from O'Hare, his coat still carrying the smell of plains and whiskey. He hugged me once, a brief, rigid embrace like greeting an acquaintance in an airport club lounge, and then went straight upstairs to my father's study with Jonathan Pierce, the family lawyer who had served the Vales for 30 years. I stood at the foot of the staircase, watching the walnut door close behind them, and felt my oldest instinct waking up again. It was not grief, not entirely. Grief was there, of course. My parents, however warped their love had been, were still my parents. But from the beginning, that grief came accompanied by something else. Vigilance. People who have lived their entire lives treating family as a structure of power do not stop that habit simply because of an accident. They only move it into the next stage through whoever is still alive. The reading of the will took place 4 days after the funeral in Jonathan Pierce's office on the 2nd floor of an old stone building downtown overlooking the Chicago River. Gray as sheet metal. His conference room was the kind built to make people sit up straighter without being told to. Dark wood, leather chairs that were firm rather than comfortable, heavy silk drapes, a painting of a winter sea behind the long table, and an antique French clock that always ran 3 minutes fast, a habit Jonathan kept for reasons no one could explain. Present that morning were me, Ethan, 2 distant relatives close enough to be notified, the company's longtime CFO Margaret H.S.U., and 2 legal assistants in Navy who practically dissolved into the wall. Jonathan looked tired in a disciplined way, his wine-colored tie a shade darker than his skin, his eyelids a touch heavy, but his back perfectly straight. He read the personal assets first. The watch collection, the paintings, the vintage cars, the house in Palm Beach, the publicly traded stock, the trusts for long-time employees, the charitable bequest. Then he came to the part everyone was waiting for while pretending not to wait. Vale Meridian Holdings, the voting rights of the principal trust, Briar House, the strategic properties, most of the authority to appoint board members, the private operating companies. Ethan leaned forward exactly half an inch when Jonathan reached that sentence. I saw it. I also saw Margaret H. Sue's hand tighten around her fountain pen. To my son, Ethan Charles Vale, Jonathan read, his voice even and thin as a blade honed to a near-silent edge. I leave my controlling interest in Vale Meridian Family Trust, my voting rights and principal stewardship authority over the operating entities, subject to the terms already set forth in the trust governance instruments. We on Briar House to Ethan, the majority of the deferred tax, liquid assets to Ethan, authority over family policy, the right to approve members of the holding company board, the temporary chairmanship of the foundation, all to Ethan. My share, a fixed income trust, the right to reside in a small coach house on the edge of the estate if I wished, a non-voting advisory seat on the foundation, and a humiliating line wrapped in polished legal prose. Recognition of my daughter Olivia's independent life and personal path outside the core business responsibilities of the family. I eared it and did not feel shock. I did not even feel anger right away. My first sensation was something colder than either. Confirmation. Everything I had been taught through thousands of small gestures had now simply been stamped, signed, and read aloud. Ethan did not look at me after that section. He looked out the window. The corner of his mouth curved in a way outsiders would call sorrow with dignity. The 2 relatives on the far side of the table exhaled so softly, it was almost nothing. One of them touched the pearls at her throat. That tiny feminine gesture people make when they have just witnessed an injustice they have no intention of interrupting. Jonathan Pierce finished reading, folded the papers shut, removed his glasses, and only then looked directly at me. That was the first moment that morning when something shifted out of the script Ethan believed he had memorized. Jonathan's eyes did not avoid mine. They landed exactly where they needed to, and stayed there a beat longer than politeness required. "There are," he said slowly, "additional governance materials and contingent instruments that are not yet ripe for general distribution." Ethan turned immediately. "What does that mean?" Jonathan laced his hands together on the table, his voice so calm it made everyone else in the room more uncomfortable. "It means not everything has been finalized yet." Ethan gave a short, brittle laugh. "Dad's dead, Jonathan. Whatever's in effect is in effect." Jonathan looked at him for so long that we could hear the HVAC hum faintly in the wall vent. "That is not always the same thing." I did not contest the will. I did not strike the table. I did not ask why. I said nothing at all except thank you to Jonathan for reading the pediatric hospital donation portion clearly. The one my mother had always supported. Ethan probably read my silence as defeat. It was, in fact, the only logical response. When you have just heard a performance you have suspected for a long time may not yet be the final layer. Jonathan met me alone that night, not at the office but in the reading room at the Union League Club, where the smell of old leather, cigar smoke trapped in the drapes, and the sound of dress shoes on wood make you feel as though you have walked into a century that never entirely died. He called me just before 9 and said that if I wanted to understand what "not yet ripe for distribution" meant, I should come immediately and come alone. I arrived in a camel coat, my hair still damp from the rain, not exactly anxious, but with the sensation of moving towards something I had been smelling in the air for a long time. Jonathan sat at a corner table with a glass of scotch barely touched before him, and a thick cream envelope sealed with red wax, stamped with the old V insignia my father used only for internal documents back when he still liked to look like a character from the 19th century. He did not bother with soft preliminaries or false gentleness. He simply slid the envelope across the table. "Your mother made me promise not to hand this over unless Charles was dead, and Ethan moved first." I sat down, removed my gloves, and looked at the seal. "What does moved first mean?" Jonathan lifted his eyes to mine, exposed his instincts. "You're speaking as if this were mythology. Your family has always preferred to call cruelty strategy. I'm only translating it more accurately." I looked at him. "You know what Ethan has been doing with the company's money." Jonathan did not deny it. He did not nod either. "I know your parents knew." The sentence moved through me like a cut so fine I barely felt it at first. "They knew for a long time. And they did nothing." Jonathan closed his eyes for the briefest second, the blink of a man who had served this family too long to keep his conscience intact. "They were waiting." Inside the envelope was a certified copy of a later will executed 6 months before their deaths, along with an 80-page trust amendment and a handwritten letter from my mother on thick ivory paper. I read it there under the low golden lamps of that old club room, with an old man in the far corner turning newspaper pages and rain tapping the bronze-framed windows. "The public will read that morning was not fake. It was real, but it was only the first layer. A layer designed to trigger the rest. The assets did indeed pass temporarily into Ethan's hands, but not unconditionally. His rights were bound to a mechanism my parents had given the nauseatingly elegant name the stewardship test, as though their children's entire lives had been arranged as an advanced morality exam in cap. If within 90 days of assuming control, Ethan committed any act in the category of unapproved self-dealing, transferred strategic assets into conflicted entities, terminated core personnel in violation of governance rules, coerced a secondary heir into signing away rights, or materially weakened the trust for personal advantage, his Entral would be automatically stripped and transferred into permanent protective stewardship. The person empowered to trigger that mechanism by presenting the evidence may Olivia Vale, not as the daughter finally loved in compensation, but as the alternate trust protector my parents had designated years earlier, in recognition of her judgment, patience, documentary discipline, and resistance to theatrical power. I reached that sentence and did not know whether to laugh or be sick. My parents, who had spent their lives teaching me to stand outside the circle, had in fact seen exactly the kind of ability they never once allowed themselves to honor openly. They had simply held it like a card at the bottom of the deck, waiting for their beloved son to prove himself greedier than redemption. My mother's letter was shorter than I expected. Her handwriting was still beautiful, slanted to the right as if even her script had been raised in a house with staff. "Olivia," she wrote, "if you are reading this, your father is dead or I am dead, and Ethan has done what he was always going to do the moment he believed no one was still watching. take too much too fast. You still believe we did not see you. That is an understandable mistake. We saw you too clearly. Ethan is force. You are resistance. He is appetite. You are memories. An empire cannot be handed to appetite without memory attached to it. We could not fix Ethan through affection, so we decided simply to let him define himself. If you choose to do nothing, the assets will remain with him, and that will be your answer. If you choose to trigger the clause, do not flatter yourself that you are doing it for fairness. This family has never operated by fairness. Do it for order, for whatever must remain standing after we are gone, even if none of you are left intact. I finished reading, and my throat felt as though I had swallowed paper. There are final words from parents that feel like being held for the first time. My mother's did not. They only confirmed the most haunting thing of all. Even in the act of placing real power in my hands, she still did not offer love. She offered function. She was still using me. Only now what she needed from me was very close to what I needed if I meant to survive. I left the Union League Club near midnight, the wind off the river cutting through the stone courtyard, city lights smearing across wet pavement, the envelope of copied documents heavy in my coat like an organ that had grown into my body overnight. In the taxi back up Lake Shore Drive, I sat watching the lights slide backward under rain, and finally named what I had been refusing to name for days. My parents had never intended to hand this empire over as a gift. For Ethan, it was bait. For me, it was a blade. Both of us had been used to preserve something larger than love. Knowing that did not make Ethan any less contemptible, but it changed the material of the ground under my feet. I was no longer merely the sideline daughter stepping into a fight for her portion. I was the surviving piece of a design my parents had built out of their 2 children. And if I kept walking forward, I would not be allowed to tell myself this was a clean story of justice. I would have to accept that I was finishing the work they had assigned. Only I was the only one who understood the human price of it. Ethan began to govern like a man, racing against something he did not want to name. In the first week after the will reading, he fired Margaret HSU with the explanation that leadership needs restructuring for the transition period. Margaret had occupied the CFO seat for 17 years and knew exactly where every financial bone was buried under the floor. He pushed the long-time real estate manager into early retirement, froze 2 community programs that offered no immediate reputational return, installed his own people inside the foundation, ordered an immediate review of selling Palm Beach to increase liquidity flexibility. He even discussed cutting part of the maintenance staff at Briar House in mid-December, the kind of decision only a person who had never truly loved a house could imagine was merely a cost column. I watched him through short meetings, performative CC'd emails, and cool congratulatory notes from bankers. Ethan did not savor his new power with the ease of a man who truly felt secure in it. He moved too fast, signed too much, touched too many core assets, met with too many private lawyers. One afternoon, I found him standing alone by my father's liquor cabinet in the library, a glass of bourbon in his hand, but his eyes fixed on nothing. For the briefest instant, he looked like someone listening for a sound behind him. When he saw me, that expression vanished. "Still here?" he asked. "This is still my house." "On paper it isn't." "Not yet." Ethan smiled with one side of his mouth. "You've always liked hearing yourself sound smarter than you are." I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe and looked at him. "You've always liked spending money faster than safety allows." His fingers tightened around the glass. "Careful, Liv." "About what?" "About confusing resentment with leverage." I smiled. "I'm no longer young enough to mistake one for the other." I did not act immediately, though the papers in my possession were already enough to start a war. Partly because Jonathan was right. Ethan needed to fail in a way no one could contest. But the more unsettling truth was that I wanted to see him more clearly. I wanted to watch what a man raised as the default heir would do the first time our parents were no longer there to absorb the blowback for him. In that sense, Ethan did not disappoint me. He began seeking me out for private conversations in hallways, beside the garage, in the library where the smell of old wood made every sentence sound like a clause in a will. He never shouted. Ethan found raised voices vulgar. What made him dangerous was the precision of his humiliation. "You're not actually planning to do anything with the foundation, are you? That advisory seat was already far too wide for you. Our parents needed a decent-looking person on the brochure, Liv. Don't confuse that with power." One night in early December, he knocked on the coach house where I was temporarily staying on the estate because I wasn't ready to leave Briar House yet. I opened the door in an old cream sweater that had once belonged to my mother, my hair still damp from a shower. Ethan stood on the front step with mist behind him, and the winter garden stripped bare. "Jonathan told you something?" he said without hello. "You've always thought anything useful in this family had to pass through you first. He looked at you wrong at the reading. Lawyers look at all kinds of people that way." Ethan tilted his head, a gesture so much like our father's that I hated him down to the bone. "You're not good enough to bluff with me." I rested my hand against the door. "You're not calm enough to pretend you're not afraid." A silence fell between us, heavy as wet velvet. Then he said something that would have broken me if I had been 5 years younger. "You were never meant to have anything." He said it gently, almost pityingly. "People kept you at the table out of courtesy. Even now, if you're given any piece of this, it will only be to stop you from making noise." I looked at him and felt something strange. No pain at all. Not anymore. Only something completely cold, like the lake after a storm. "Say that again," I said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Why? Because you're going to have to say it somewhere else. And I want to hear whether it still sounds steady when this porch is no longer behind you." He laughed very softly. "In court?" "Really?" I held his gaze. "Say it again." "In court." For the first time since the funeral, I saw him truly uncertain of what kind of ground he was standing on. "I hired my own counsel that week, not one of the marble and press release firms that lived off spectacle, but Caroline Sloan, feared in Chicago for trust litigation precisely, because she made wealthy families feel dread rather than comfort. Caroline was in her 40s, hair cut with surgical precision, black pointed shoes always as clean as instruments, and a voice that sounded as though every sentence had been passed through a filter that removed all excess emotion. Jonathan Pierce worked with her because he understood he had spent too long inside the veil machine to serve both as witness and guide. The months that followed became a chain of conference rooms, scans, deposition prep, memos, forensic reports, stale coffee, and the white light of offices after 7 at night. Caroline was the first person to say the thing that offended me because it was true. "If you do this," she said, flipping through Ethan's transactions from the first 21 days after the will reading, "you do not get to remain sentimental about the architecture of your pain. Either you break him cleanly, or you let him keep the story." I sat opposite her, my fingers damp against my water glass. "I don't want cheap revenge." "Good. Cheap revenge is for people with less at stake." She slid the first analysis toward me. Ethan had moved money from 3 core entities into a side real estate fund with a direct conflict of interest, constituting self-dealing under the prohibited clause in the amendment. He had used temporary authority to force Margaret out, violating the core personnel protection provision. He had attempted to pressure me into signing away consultation rights in the foundation. I had refused, but the email invitation alone was already evidence. "He's already failed," Caroline said. "The only question is whether you want to pull the wire now or wait until the whole structure collapses around him." I remember looking out the window then. Thin snow moved across the glass towers of River North, pale as ash. "He has lived his entire life believing everything would keep choosing him no matter what he did," I said. "This time I want nothing to hold him." Caroline nodded as though there were no other respectable answer. "Legal war in families like ours never happens only in court. It happens in the private bar of the country club, at the luncheon tables of elderly aunts, inside intentionally forwarded emails, in the way a banker delays returning your call by 5 minutes to signal that everyone is waiting to see who truly holds the key." Ethan hired a litigation team so large their offices looked like a marble exhibition, and immediately began telling the version of the story he liked best. The sidelined younger sister had finally exploded out of envy, was exploiting our parents' deaths to sabotage the company, and was hiding behind technicalities to steal the role from the only person ever trained to carry it. And because our world loves order more than justice, that story worked at first. Some calls stopped being returned quickly. Some acquaintances sent messages like, "I hope you and Ethan find a private path through this." Some of my mother's old friends came to a winter memorial at the museum and held my hand a touch longer than usual, the sort of politeness that suggests they believe you are wounded, but perhaps also excessive. I had to sit through one of Ethan's lawyers referring to me, at a preliminary mediation session, as an emotionally activated secondary beneficiary. I had to watch my brother sit across from me in navy blue, my father's Patek visible at his cuff, wearing precisely the right amount of tiredness to resemble the victim of an undeserved blow. There were nights I drove back north along Sheridan Road through dirty snow, financial news muttering from the radio, my hands cold on the wheel, and genuinely did not know what exactly I was trying to save anymore. The company, order itself, or the last intact part of me that could not bear to let Ethan tell this story in my place. That was the heaviest middle portion of it all, not the existence of evidence, but the fact that evidence had to pass through a world already conditioned to protect men like him using the polished language of civility. Then my parents' trap began to close, not because of divine justice, simply because Ethan could not resist being himself. In the first financial quarter after taking control, he tried to restructure Vale Meridian Real Estate Trust through a series of transactions he believed were sophisticated enough to slip through before anyone had time to reset the map. But Ethan made the mistake indulgent heirs always make. He assumed no one still had the patience to read the endless gray paperwork in which real power is actually tied down. I had read it. Margaret, even after being forced out, had preserved internal memos. Jonathan still had the timestamps. Caroline had a forensic team. And most importantly, my parents' trust amendment was written with an almost cruel clarity. Proof of self-enrichment through conflicted transfer alone was sufficient to trigger forfeiture. Ethan did it not once but 3 times, each time quickly, each time cleanly enough to satisfy himself, and stupidly in the particular way of a man convinced he has outgrown the system that raised him. We filed the motion on the very day he planned to sign away a portion of industrial land in Elgin to a side fund controlled by an old college friend. The hearing did not take place in some dark wood-paneled courtroom from a film, but in a modern, emotionally sterile probate hearing room in Chicago, where the fluorescent light made every face look washed out and gave the truth fewer places to hide. Ethan entered with counsel and did not look at me. His collar sat perfectly, his hair was in place, but by then I had learned enough to see the compressed urgency in the way he walked. Jonathan Pierce was there as a witness. Caroline stood beside me with a binder tabbed in colors like a machine, assembled to kill with paper. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. Ethan's lawyers tried to turn everything into a conflict of testamentary intent and ambiguity between the public will and the trust. Caroline sliced through each layer in a tone so calm it became vicious. Jonathan confirmed that the triggering clause had been drafted under the direct instruction of Charles and Alina, that the public will was only a temporary transfer layer, and that the amendment formed an inseparable part of their final intent. Margaret HSU appeared almost theatrically, an additional blade, producing internal memos Ethan had demanded be destroyed. The transfer records were projected onto the screen, streams of money running from Vale Meridian into intermediate entities and back toward Ethan's personal orbit like ink, finally rising under developer fluid. At one point, Ethan's lawyer attempted to invoke the operational flexibility owed to a successor steward, and Caroline responded with a line I still remember intact. Flexibility is not a synonym for theft merely because the man doing it inherited the stationery. I did not look around the room then. I only watched Ethan. His face began to lose the social material that had protected him his whole life. He did not collapse beautifully. Ethan was not built for elegant ruin. He broke by tightening, then hardening, then finally revealing a kind of emptiness difficult to hide once he realized that the very machine which had raised him was now swallowing him back. When the judge ruled that the trust amendment was valid and that the forfeiture clause had been triggered, the room went so silent I could hear paper shifting on the clerk's desk. Vale Meridian Family Trust did not pass entirely into my name like a fairy tale crown. My parents had never been generous in that way. The assets were transferred into permanent protective stewardship, with me installed as sole managing steward, holding full operational control under strict fiduciary limits. Ethan was stripped of all voting power, all dispositive authority, and reduced to a fixed income distribution under close supervision. In other words, he lost the one thing he had believed all his life was his by birthright: the ability to command. On top of that came the recommendation for civil and tax investigation into the transactions he had executed during the transition window. There was no dramatic gavel strike. No one exhaled for effect. There was simply a man sitting in a hearing room, finally understanding that what he thought was an inheritance had in fact been a test he had already failed before he ever sat down to claim it. I turned and looked at him for the first time in almost 4 hours. Ethan looked back, not in anger, not pleading. What was in his eyes was colder than both. Insult, as though I had not just taken something from him, but the universe itself had committed a grave offense by daring to deny him. Perhaps that was the only thing about Ethan that never changed. He always treated limits as acts of personal betrayal. After the hearing, his collapse unfolded in the quiet, total way a very expensive building loses power 1 floor at a time. The board members who had once laughed and drunk bourbon with him at Anwencia stopped calling late at night. A few began messaging me with exaggerated care and polished civility, as if trying to erase their fingerprints from my brother's back as quickly as possible. The bankers who had called him a young lion began substituting phrases like regrettable misjudgment. The penthouse he had temporarily leased in the Gold Coast was given up early. The woman he had been seeing in the months after the funeral disappeared from the dinner circuit, as though absorbed into mist. The invisible walls of old money never need to throw anyone out with words. They simply stop inviting, stop shielding. Stop believing a man can still embody continuity when he has just demonstrated his willingness to set the beams on fire to warm his hand. Ethan still had money, still had fine clothes, still had a decent apartment, club memberships, lawyers competent enough to keep him technically intact, but he no longer possessed the gravitational center around which everyone arranged themselves. I know that to many outsiders, that still would not sound like enough pain. Perhaps it isn't, but for men raised in the certainty that they are the default center of every room, being pushed to the edge is not merely losing assets. It is losing the definition of self. I assumed control of what remained in late spring. There was no coronation, no music, no flattering magazine profile, only endless meetings, audits, personnel reviews, trust cleanup, role restructuring, buried liabilities, halted fire sales, and the slow rebuilding of a machine Ethan had destabilized through fear and flattery. In those first weeks, I sat in the corner office on the 3rd floor of the downtown headquarters, the office that had once belonged to my father, watching the Chicago River move under the steel bridges, and feeling as though I were living inside a paradox my parents would have admired for its cruelty. I had power at last, but it had arrived not as recognition of my worth, but as the consequence of my brother's failure on a test our parents had set for him. No one called to say they were proud of me. No letter arrived apologizing for the years I had been left outside the circle. There were only legal documents, transferred signatures, and my mother's pitiless words still echoing in my head. Do not flatter yourself that you are doing this for fairness. She was right. I was not doing it for fairness. In a world like ours, fairness is a word used by people who have never understood how a family like mine actually works. I was doing it because if I did not, Ethan would tear it into pieces and sell those pieces to his own vanity. I was doing it because if I had already been used as the memory of this family, then I would at least decide which memory would remain and which would be buried. But victory, if anyone still insists on calling it that, did not make me clean. It only made me effective. That was the coldest truth I had to admit in the years afterward. I was good at this, better than Ethan, perhaps better than my parents had ever allowed themselves to say while they were alive. I knew when to keep an old executive, because he remembered what younger people never could. I knew when to kill a project, because it inflated reports without feeding the core. I knew how to sit still long enough that others began speaking past the point they intended. I knew how to make a man who had always underestimated me hand over information simply because he could not bear a silence he did not control. There were mornings I walked the walnut-paneled halls of headquarters, hearing the strike of my own heels, seeing assistants rise when I appeared, and something in me recognized too late that surviving people like my parents and Ethan does not only make you stronger, it also makes you resemble them in certain ways. I did not shout. I did not humiliate staff in public. I did not use love as leverage, but I understood the power of staying still and letting another person shrink under your gaze. I understood how to end a conversation in 4 words. I understood how to release one piece of truth at exactly the right moment and let the rest collapse under its own weight. Those understandings came at the cost of something softer in me, something that may have existed only faintly even when I was a girl standing outside the library listening to my father teach Ethan about container yard. It did not die all at once. It was worn away each time I noticed myself using the same cold patience that had once been used on me. I saw Ethan one last time in the true sense of a face-to-face reckoning in late autumn the following year, at Briar House, just before I chose to close the north wing and turn the old library into a private archive for the foundation. He arrived unannounced in a charcoal coat, his hair cut shorter than before, his face leaner, sharper, the face of a man who had not slept deeply in a very long time. The old house manager came to tell me I was wanted in the conservatory. I said to let him in. When Ethan crossed the glass threshold, the cold from the lake came with him, carrying the scent of wet leaves and icy water. The dwarf orange trees still sat under heat lamps in their terracotta pots. The smell of warm soil and fertilizer mixed with the metallic chill of the evening. He looked around once and then at me. "You really intend to keep this mausoleum?" he asked. I was wearing gardening gloves, trimming a diseased branch from my mother's rosemary. "It's a house," Ethan gave a small laugh. "No, it's evidence." I pulled off my gloves and set the shears down. "What do you want?" He slipped his hands into his coat pockets, the old gesture of a man about to say something he had already justified to himself 100 times. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to see what it looks like when you finally get everything you spent your whole life pretending not to want." I looked at him for a long time. "You still think this was about wanting what was yours, wasn't it?" "No." I stepped a little closer, enough to see the bluish fatigue beneath his eyes and the tiny scarred pore in his left cheek he had hated as a teenager. "This was about you thinking everything would keep choosing you, even after your greed began speaking louder than anything else." Ethan looked at me with that gaze that had made so many men step backward in boardroom. It no longer worked the way it once had, but the mechanism in him had not yet accepted that. "They never loved you the way you wanted," he said, and his voice softened in a way that made it crueler than shouting ever could. "You know that. That's the funniest part of all this. You think you won, but all they did was use you after death the same way they used you in life." Because it was partly true, the sentence went into me more deeply than I wanted to admit. I said nothing. Ethan saw that, and like all drowning people who still want company on the way down, took one more step. "They still chose me first." I heard the heating system in the conservatory kick on somewhere above us. A dried orange leaf fell to the tile. "Yes," I said, "and you still managed to destroy even that choice so quickly they did not have to live to be disappointed in you." That was when he turned his face away. Not exactly because he had lost the exchange. I think it was because, for the first time, he truly saw the most terrible truth of all. Our parents had not left him love or trust, even in distorted form. They had left him a test they were almost certainly expecting him to fail. Ethan left Briar House 10 minutes later. No embrace, no handshake, no promise, no threat. Only cold air and wet footprints on the stone floor of the conservatory. Marks that dried within the hour, though I remembered them for much longer than that, as if they were a temporary kind of writing. If you are waiting for the ending where everything is set right, I don't have. I have the assets, the control, the meetings where people now listen to me, without looking over my shoulder for Ethan. I have the house if I want to keep it, or the right to sell it if I choose, and enough paper to rebuild the power structure of this family more cleanly than my parents ever did. I also have nights where I wake at 3 in the morning alone in the room that once belonged to my mother, listening to the wind strike the shutters from the lake, unable to remember the last time I believed in familial love without conditions attached. No, there is no Noah and Emma in this story. No children to soften the edges. Only me, Ethan, our parents, and a legacy that turned every remaining relationship into a question of function. I have loyal employees who look at me with a mixture of gratitude and caution because they understand that I survived the same system that produced Ethan. I was not dropped from heaven by morality. I have solitary dinners in a dining room too large for one person, yellow light glancing off silverware engraved with the Vale monogram, and the sensation of sitting inside both a reward and a prison at once. There are moments when I look at the oil portrait of my parents on the landing halfway up the staircase, my mother in plum velvet, my father with a pocket watch like his own father before him, and I honestly do not know which hurts more. That they never loved me in the way a child needs, or that in the end they were the people who understood. Most clearly what I would do if placed in precisely the role they had spent a lifetime preparing me for without ever admitting. The upper classes like to call what they leave behind legacy, as though assets can sanitize motive. But legacy is not what sits in a trust under your name. It is what remains alive inside the people through whom it has passed. Ethan lost nearly everything that mattered to him. Voting power, command, the story he told about himself, the network of reflexive deference, part of his liquid fortune, and whatever remained of the illusion that he was the future simply because he existed. I, the one outsiders would say inherited my father's coldness, my mother's patience, and too deep an understanding of the ways a family can use intimacy as a mechanism of governance. There are mornings I walk into the boardroom, watch everyone stand, and see myself reflected in the glass of the door, standing very still before I speak, waiting for the room to adjust itself around me. That moment frightens me more than anything, not because I hate power, but because I know how perfectly it fits now. Many months after the hearing, when winter had locked the lake into a sheet of pale lead, and Briar House had gone so quiet I could hear the heating pipes contract inside the walls, I opened my mother's last letter again. There was one line near the end that I had missed the first time because I had been too busy hating it. "You will think the most frightening part is Ethan," she wrote. "No, the most frightening part is that one day you will understand why we did it." I sat in the library with the fake gas fire throwing almost no real warmth, the desk lamp pooling light over the ivory paper, and knew that my mother had won one final time. Not because I forgave her. I did not. Not because I agreed with them. I am not sure I ever could agree with anything built on turning two children into two complementary functions for an empire. But I understood, and in families like mine, understanding is the most toxic form of intimacy there is. It draws you closer to the people who hurt you more effectively than love ever could. It makes you carry on their work, even after you have lowered them into the ground. It makes you look at your brother's greed, his hunger for recognition, his fear of disappearing, and recognize outlines that are not entirely foreign. That is what makes this ending cold. Not that my brother lost almost everything, but that I kept enough to go on. And the price of going on was losing the right to remain innocent about what I was holding in my hands. Now, if someone asks what happened after my parents died, I can give them the short version polished enough for a financial profile or a charity dinner where no one wants the smell of blood too near the Dover soul. I can say my brother believed he inherited everything, but his reckless transactions triggered the protective clause in the trust, and in the end, control passed to me under my parents' final intent. I can say greed destroyed him. I can say truth, timing, and paper are stronger than a loud voice. All of that would be true, but none of it would be the whole. The whole is this: my brother thought he inherited the world. What he actually inherited was the consequence of his own greed. And I, the child underestimated long enough to learn how to see into the dark corners of every room, inherited something far more brutal. I inherited an empire, yes, but along with it came the irreversible knowledge that the people who created us had treated both of their children as instruments to preserve the order they cared about more than love. I survived. I won if you measure by structure, but something inside me changed beyond repair on the road to that victory. And no lawyer, no trust, no number of shares can return it. Some victories free a person. Mine only gave me a beautiful chair in the last room of the House of Vale, where I sit alone looking out over a lake dark as metal beneath the window, understanding that coldness is not always temperament. Sometimes it is simply what remains after love has been used up for other purposes.